Pancholi, ladies and gentlemen, I thank the Citizens for Democracy for invite. जी तिरंगे ऑफ तो नहीं जी जी मैं हिंदी जानता हूँ, पर हिंदी बोलने में और मेरी सोच जो अंग्रेज़ी में है वही उसके अनुवाद करते करते कहीं ना कहीं कुछ हिचकिचाहट आ जाती है। तो नहीं तो I was thanking the Citizens for Democracy for calling me, and as Mr. Nair just now put it, this is a historic site where the first fight against the emergency began. And at that point of time, I was 10 years old. I was in Bombay. And in Bombay, as a young child of 10 years going to the 5th standard, all that I knew was my father coming home that evening of June 26th and telling my mother, Indira Gandhi has become a dictator. My father had some political affiliations. Arrests had started. We were fearful as a family. I remember as a growing up kid, the eldest son with children much younger, my mother's worried face. And it is that emotion which probably defines what I've grown up to be as a lifelong questioner of authority and authoritarian figures. My memory of the Citizens for Democracy comes from then, in 1977, when suddenly Babu Jagjeevan Ram and H.N. Bahuguna left the Congress, joined the Citizens for Democracy, and from there on, the turnaround in fortunes of Mrs. Gandhi started. And I still remember that we lived in Bombay on the second floor, and down there was a scoreboard being written continuously of bulletins from the Election Commission that so and so has lost in Raebareli, so and so has lost in Amethi, that the Congress president has lost somewhere. And the emotion that I most remember is that joy of that day when we thought that freedom which was lost had come back. But then each generation, and I'm glad to see that we have at least a few young people out here, each generation, the current affairs of a generation become history for another generation. And what we felt when it was bliss in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven, can never really be transmitted on to a later generation, and each generation has to fight its own fights. Today, we may not be in an emergency, but there is certainly a chilling effect. There is an effect of an authoritarian leader, an approved doctrine, the necessity of the intelligentsia or some part of the intelligentsia to say, no, yes, we are with the approved doctrine, because if we have to go ahead in life or if we have to continue on our path to progress, we need to be on the right side. There are also, thankfully, many of us who are dissenting voices. There are many of us who have come from an earlier era who still remember what it is to have at least a glimpse of that fight. Mr. Nair is fortunate to have seen two such eras. Some of us have seen one era, and as the Chinese proverb goes, may you live in interesting times. Each generation sometimes lives in its interesting times. And these interesting times have today forced us to ask this question: would we survive as a democratic, secular polity? What are the challenges before the country? One thing that strikes me is what Mr. Nariman recently said. Mr. Fali Nariman, the Bhishma Pitama of the Indian judicial system, he reminded us of something very significant. He said that it is the Hindus who granted themselves a magnificent constitution. If the Hindus change their mind, then the constitution itself will change. But what was it in the minds of our constitution makers which brought forth that magnificent constitution? There were three things. One was the experience of the freedom struggle, where irrespective of differences on religion, on caste, and so many things, everybody fought together for one common goal. But when freedom was achieved against the backdrop of two great events of horrifying proportions of killing. We had the Second World War, the entire loss of life, which went almost as a consequence of one race asserting that it was a superior race, that it was born to rule the world, and that those who it condemned as being the lowest of the low, the Jewish, there was a slaughter of 6 million in Jews in Europe. There was all that bloodshed, and that was on an international scale. And in India, despite seeing that happen in Europe from 1939 to 1945, we in 45 onwards, 45, 46, 47, Direct Action Day, the reactions and everything, we ourselves went mad. We had partition. And after partition, as the Constituent Assembly debated, the Constituent Assembly had one more tragedy visited. That was the assassination of the Mahatma. So we had three great lessons paid for in blood, which warned our constitution makers of that day. And that is why, while they wrote a magnificent charter of rights for every citizen, they wrote a whole scheme. They copied a lot from the British as far as the governance of India went, but the relationship between the state and the citizen is what defined that constitution. Probably the one thing that the constitution makers, to my mind, got wrong was to have minority rights defined in terms of communities. It was a simple thing that minorities were protected insofar as conserving their religion, their script, their language was concerned. Those are the only fundamental rights which are given to a community as a whole. But what if the constitution makers at that stage had probably thought a little further, or if I had been there, or they had the benefit of this experience, probably the message that would have gone was that each individual citizen is a minority of one. All of us have several identities. If you take my religious identity, I may be a majority, but as a linguistic speaker of Kannada, of Tulu, I am a minority. In a country, in a new country which was being built, to again bring in community-based rights, and was, to my mind, sometimes an invitation to perpetual warring among communities. Majoritarian tendencies didn't start immediately in the New Republic with religion. Majoritarian tendencies started with language. It started when Hindi was sought to be imposed all over the country. And that was from one of our best prime ministers, neither from the family nor from the parivar. Lal Bahadur Shastri took that decision. And it was at that point of time that a minority stood up. And that minority was C.N. Annadurai. C.N. Annadurai standing up for the continuance of English ensured that the imposition of Hindi was lost by one vote. We did not realize what a benefit we got then, because what happened in 65 inexorably shaped us as a nation when that opportunity came with the internet, with business process outsourcing, when we had a large mass of India which was proficient in English, which could work with the globe on a global scale. The point I simply seek to make to you is this. Nayyar Sahib spoke of the idea of India. The idea of India being democracy as far as voting goes, the idea of India being secularism as voting goes. I think there is one further idea that we need, the idea of the Indian. And the idea of the Indian is a man or a woman who is proudly multicultural, multilingual. Almost every educated Indian today is at least bilingual, if not trilingual. He has access to the world, he has access to his village, his roots, and he has access to a large mass of people through a language which is spoken by many. When you can think in three languages, when you can communicate in three languages, you have three identities at least. Is it so difficult for us to work together as a nation with so many other religions? Most of us, many of us, are comfortable celebrating festivals of other religions, or at least greeting our friends of other faiths on their religious holidays. I don't see why we should, as Indians, draw ourselves into narrow domestic walls of religious identities when it comes to thinking politically. I think that is the true danger that has happened in India from the time I grew up as a young man, from the time I went into college. When I went into college, one of my memories, again from Bombay, was 1985, when after the Shah Banu verdict of the Supreme Court, you had the whole, on a Friday evening, you had a huge procession right up to the fort area, Hutatma Chowk and everything, and it was full. The march was silent. The march protested against a Supreme Court judgment. The consequence of those marches was that the law was changed. But the consequence of that change of law was an immediate assertion of identity politics on the other side also. Because shortly, the rulers of that day thought that if you give one community something, you might as well give the other community something else. They opened the locks of the Babri Masjid or allowed a court to pass an order. After that, it was in 89 you had the Shilanyas, 92 you had the demolition, 2002 you had the riots in Gujarat, and each and every one of these tragic events have defined the course of our nation, the trajectory of politics, the trajectory of who gets elected and who loses out in elections. But not one of us has really thought outside the box of community and religious identities to just say, as a multicultural person myself, where do I stand on these issues and why should I allow politicians to exploit me? That somehow never happens, and here I can't think of a better example than what a very famous judge called Learned Hand in the US said. He called it the spirit of liberty, and his words are very prescient. He spoke of it in the context of America. I still think sometimes that for the individual Indian, for the individual thinking Indian, it is all about liberty. If you want the country to be free, you cannot have it full of people who have given up their freedom, who have laid their freedom at the feet of a great man and said, no, you run the country. We need to, each of us contribute by not accepting the current, whatever is the logic of the ruler which is handed down to us. We need to think in the spirit of liberty. And to return to Justice Learned Hand, says, what then is the spirit of liberty? I cannot define it. I can only tell you my own faith. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which seeks to understand the minds of other men and women. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which weighs their interest alongside its own without bias. The spirit of liberty remembers that not even a sparrow falls to the earth unheeded. The spirit of the liberty is the spirit of him who near 2000 years ago taught mankind a lesson that it has never learnt, but has never quite forgotten. That there may be a kingdom where the least shall be heard and considered side by side with the greatest. So that is the spirit. Think individually. Think for the other and ensure a country where the voice of the last, the least and the lost is heard. Do not think as a herd. All of us are 1.33 billion people. we together constitute the country. And when the rights of any one individual are trampled on, the rights of the country are trampled on. And it is in that, in the defense of the individual, lies the country's salvation. I thank you for a very patient hearing.